share some lessons that we've learned in a place in southeast BC and northwest Montana across the US-Canada international boundary down there. And so this here, I'm going to talk to you about two different rivers. The first river is the Flathead River in southeast British Columbia. It's in the very, very far corner of southeast BC. And it's entirely within the Contamination territory of southeast British Columbia. And the other river that I have been working in is the Elk River. It's a tributary of the Kootenai River system, also right next door to the Flathead River in southeast BC. And the difference between the Flathead River and the Elk River, which is obvious from the photos, is that the Flathead River has been set aside, has permanent protection from oil and gas and mining in that landscape. The Elk River has been entirely dedicated to mining and has experienced the open pit coal mining industry for almost a century now. I started working in this region in early 2000. I did my master's work at the University of Montana looking at coal bed methane production actually in the East Kootenai coal fields of southeast BC. So the East Kootenai coal fields are the coal deposits that have been mined in the Elk River Valley extensively. But in the early 2000s, there was also a great deal of interest in introducing coal bed methane into that landscape as well. And so this is an early map from the province of British Columbia showing the coal fields of British Columbia, and then in writing, which you don't really need to see, it just gives the estimated coal bed methane potential for those coal field deposits. And that's how I was first introduced to this landscape down here. Next slide. So I'm going to go through just kind of a very high level mining basics just to bring us all onto the same page. And so essentially to mine successfully, you have to remove what is called overburden, but is actually, in this case, is a mountain, and remove that to get to your targeted seam that you want to mine, and that's the same for hard rock mining, for metals, for gold, copper, and also for coal. And the most economically efficient way to mine, it's not the best for the environment, but it's the way that we currently do it, is to take that overburden or the mountain that you've removed to get to the coal and put it in what's called a valley fill. And we usually deposit this right adjacent to the location of the mine, which tends to position that waste rock in such a way that it can leach into your watershed. Next slide. And so this is just getting into a little bit more detail, but every step of the mining process creates a way in which contaminants can enter into your watershed. And so when you go to mine, you initially will blast away the rock. You use dynamite to do that, and that can introduce nitrates and sulfates into your watershed. The valley fill is a source of contaminants, so anything that's in your underlying geology can become a contaminant in your watershed when it's exposed to air and water. And then the sediment pond or holding pond is another place that contaminants can be introduced into your watershed. And if you happen to have any reservoirs or dams downstream, those are also a place where contamination can build up from your mining process. So it's like an area that you can end up with a high concentration of contaminants from mining. We come from a biological station that looks at, that studies lakes and rivers extensively, and so we've come to call the types of rivers that you have up here and that we have down there, and that are really globally sort of important gravel bed rivers. And a gravel bed river is essentially these valley bottom rivers that tend to come from sometimes glaciated mountains and can be very sensitive to the impacts of mining in these types of rivers. So I'm going to go through a little bit of truths about gravel bed rivers that make them especially vulnerable to the impacts of mining. And when we look at mining impacts, a lot of times these are some of the terms that we'll use. We look at the fate of the contaminants, which means where are they going to end up in in your watershed or in your landscape or in your species. The transport, how do they get there? And then the receptors, which are anything in your environment that can take up the contaminants that are coming from the mine. So that can be your river water or your fish or your wildlife or birds, anything that's going to come into contact with your watershed. Just some basics of how these gravel bed rivers work that make them really vulnerable to the contamination from mining. So this is a floodplain in the Flathead River Basin. It's not the part of the Flathead that I showed you earlier, but it's a different fork of the Flathead. And it could be any floodplain anywhere that is unconfined, so it doesn't have human settlement in it or any riprap or anything like that. It has the ability to move freely. The river has the ability to move freely in its floodplain. And that's sort of one of the first universal truths about these gravel bed rivers, is that they alternate freely across the channels within the floodplain. And you can see this, we've done some work on this. Some researchers at my research station have looked at this, and you can see here, this just basically shows the different colors are showing you how many times this river changed position in its channel over the course of between 1945 and 2004, and the surface water at any given time over these decades changed places 9 times, at least 9 times. And so it just shows what I was saying in the previous slide, which is that these rivers move freely across their floodplain. And then over here on this slide, you can just see that about 75% of the river within this floodplain is constantly changing. It's dynamic. And really the blue parts are where it's more stable. And so thinking from the perspective of if you put a mine at the top of this floodplain, how much possibility there is for contaminants to move across the environment. The other sort of universal truth about these rivers is that the surface water and groundwater are always interchanging as you move down the river. And this slide is showing in blue, you can see areas of downwelling, which is where surface water is going down under the ground into the groundwater. And the green dots are areas where there isn't any interchange happening. And then the red dots are upwelling zones in the watershed where that groundwater is then coming back up to the surface and joining the surface water. And so that's another way in which it makes it very complicated to be able to track contamination across a river environment and understand where any of your contaminants could be going and how long they're going to be underground versus above ground across the watershed. And so these areas of upwelling are really important. They're really important for fish and aquatic life in the rivers. And I think you guys have data like this from up here, from the salmon. For us, where we are, it's West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout are our big fish in our rivers. And this is just showing that as you move down the watershed and you increase the number of areas of upwelling, then you get higher reds per density as you're moving down the stream. And what's going on here is that these upwelling zones are really nutrient rich. They're bringing up from underneath from the groundwater a lot of nutrients to the surface. And then the reds, the spawning reds, in this case bull trout reds, are keying in on those areas where the upwelling is coming up from below the surface. So this is just a really basic diagram, but I think it makes a really good point about what you have to think about in terms of contamination in a river. So rivers really function in at least 3 dimensions, and the first being from upstream to downstream. So if you were to put a mine up here at the top of the watershed, then you're going to have to be concerned about where contamination goes in your surface water. Next slide, please. One more, thanks. And then vertically, moving down into the alluvial aquifer through that groundwater, surface water exchange. One more, please. And then laterally across the floodplain. So where the surface water is flowing isn't necessarily encompass the entire river. It's actually the whole floodplain that the river can move within. And so this gives multiple pathways for contamination across your watershed. And a lot of just creates quite a bit of complexity into when you're trying to understand where your contaminants can go and how you might get them out if they get into your watershed. And I think you all probably know this. When you spend time in rivers or living around them or amongst them, you know that they're very rich areas for ecological diversity. The river is sort of where all the magic happens with respect to the life in the watershed. And this is something, like I said, I think we know intuitively, but there's a lot of science out there to support this that shows that there's higher species diversity for your birds in the watershed in the river. There's a lot of predator-prey interactions that take place around your watershed corridor that are really important to the environment. This is, again, there's more information coming out all the time about how important rivers are to the whole environment that they're a part of. And so if you look across an entire landscape, you'll find your highest biodiversity in the environment right along the river corridor, and that's just what this is showing. And so going with what we're talking about as far as mining contamination in your watershed, this is a point of contact for all this different species and life to cut for as far as contaminants in the watershed. And those things that make rivers rich in biodiversity, their complexity and their connectivity and the upwelling and the downwelling, all of that also makes them very vulnerable to the impacts of contamination from mining. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and sort of talk about what I have learned about over the last decade or so in southeast British Columbia and northwest Montana. So we're going to be talking about, this is the Elk River. It flows into the Kootenai River system, as I said earlier. And it's really interesting, it kind of knits the international border together across BC and Montana and Idaho and back into Canada. And then ultimately joining the Columbia River system. So that's the first river, and then the second one is the Flathead River. And the Flathead River is right next door to the Elk River, and it's in this blue line. And it starts in southeast BC, flows into Montana, and also joins the Columbia River system. And there's the Flathead there's the international border between the US and Canada, very natural line.
Oh, the wall.
The border spot. So, and then these are the fish from my home. So on the left here you have bull trout. They're the biggest predator in these systems, and they are at the top of the food chain. And then the West Slope cutthroat trout here on the left. And both of these fish are listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. So bull trout are threatened or endangered. West Slope cutthroat trout are threatened. And they also have, West Slope cutthroat have special or SARA-listed species on the Canadian side. So they're really important fish in the system and recognized as such. So I first started working in this environment, as I said, in the early 2000s, when there were mining proposals for both coal bed methane and coal developments in the Flathead River. And so the pink on this is the East Kootenai coal fields. And this is the Elk right here. And so they've been extensively developed in the Elk River, but there's quite a bit of the East Kootenai coal fields underneath the Flathead River as well. And they had not been developed to date, but there was quite a bit of interest and several different types of mining proposals in the Flathead River at the time. So because the Flathead was such an unimpacted environment at the time, and actually there's no permanent human residence in the Flathead River in British Columbia. There are outfitter leases, guide outfitter leases, but there's no permanent settlements or homes or people. So there was a lot of question about what's the risk of mining in the headwaters of the Flathead River? What's that going to mean for this particular landscape and all the life that are a part of it? And so there was a lot of concern on both sides of the boundary from agencies and just citizens of the Flathead River Valley and the First Nation in the region about what the impacts might be. And so the first questions we started asking were, what's the resource that's going to be impacted? And the reason we asked this is because the company had been saying that they knew they could mitigate for any impacts they might introduce into the watershed. And we started to look into it and discovered that there wasn't any baseline data for the Flathead River in British Columbia. And so it was very concerning that, how could the company mitigate for impacts if they didn't actually know what the existing water quality was, or what contaminant, what the levels of the underlying levels from the geology were as far as what would be potential contaminants. And another thing that concerned us was that the mining company had said there weren't any fish-bearing streams downstream of the proposed mine. And our biologists in Montana had tracked bull trout and west slope cutthroat trout right up to the international boundary, and so they felt that there was probably bull trout and west slope cutthroat trout in the upper portion of the river as well. So we started to, and this is a big we, there's a lot of people involved in this. I'm not the only person that was involved in this. And so we started asking, what fish are there, what's the water quality, and so on. And then we realized that we had the Elk River right next door. And so once again, here's the Flathead, here's the Elk. In orange, you can see 5 open pit coal mines in the Elk. The red are proposed mines, non-tech coal mines, and those are still proposals that are ongoing today. But because we were interested in the potential impacts of mining in the non-mined river, we thought that we could go into the Elk River and collect data to look at the mining impacts in the adjacent river. And we felt that we could compare these because, as I said before, these rivers arise from similar underlying geology. The East Kootenai coal fields run all the way beneath these rivers, and they're actually really similar to each other, except for that one is mined and one isn't. So we put in place a pretty simple study design. We basically we put some sites above the mines in the Elk River to get a reference condition, so what's the the non-mined condition in the Elk River. And then we put a series of sites, these red stars, moving down the Elk River beneath each of the mine sites. And then in the Flathead River, which is kind of hard, this is kind of a tough map, we looked above the proposed mine in the Flathead River, and then downstream of the proposed mine, and then a little bit further down the river in the Flathead. So we were basically looking for mined versus unmined condition. We collected data in both of these rivers for about 5 years and sampled for many different contaminants. We did a full suite of water chemistry. We looked at my fisheries biologist colleagues, looked at fish and fish tissue, and we studied quite a bit of different things. But I'm just going to highlight a few because it would take a long time if I went through all of it. The Elk River Basin sites, these are the above the mines for nitrates in the river, and then these are the below the mine sites for nitrates in the river. And as I said earlier, nitrates are a byproduct of blasting to remove the overburden, the rock above the coal seam that you're going to mine. And then just because we were looking for baseline in the Flathead, we wanted to see the difference between a mine and unmined system. So the Flathead doesn't even register on this graph. Here's the Flathead sites. And then here are the Elk River sites for nitrogen in the river. So selenium, you can see here, Elk River Basin above the mines, small portions of selenium, and to answer the question you asked last time, 2 micrograms per liter is the provincial guideline for selenium, so it would be right here. And then the Elk River below the mines, you can see that we're looking at up to 5 times the provincial guideline. These data are, at this point, a little outdated. We stopped collecting data around 2011 in the rivers, and now the Elk River numbers are much higher than this. And again, to see the Flathead are in pink, and the Elk River downstream of the mines are in blue. And this, I'd like to point out here that a lot of times you'll hear that there is a natural level for selenium or heavy metals in a watershed, and that's what you're seeing here. This is your natural level, and this is your mined condition. So there's a big difference between your natural underlying levels of a contaminant and what you get when you expose your rock to air and water and allow those contaminants to start leaching into your river. So this is just to summarize. These are, as I said, the contaminants that we had the biggest red flags on between the Elk and the Flathead River. Nitrates 1 to 2,000 times higher in the Elk downstream of the mines. Sulfates 1 to 200 times higher, and selenium 15 to 30 times higher. So we also looked at aquatic macroinvertebrates, or bugs, in the water, sort of one of the bases of the food chain for the fish in the system. And as I said, we were sort of trying to link water quality with, we looked at periphyton and algae as well, but I'm not going to go through those results, and then we looked at bugs, because they're really good indicators of contamination in your river. And we use this is called a Stanford Hauer kick net. That's how you go in, you kick the rocks, you collect the bugs in a net, and then next slide, put them in a bucket, and then you take it back to the lab and go through them. And we saw some interesting things with respect to the bugs in the river. So these are stoneflies, and you can see in the Flathead, over here the blue squares are all the genus and species that we found when we did these sampling and data collection. And then you can see what we found in the Elk. So obviously a pretty big difference in diversity in the Elk River, as well as abundance of different species. So look at the difference between these purple guys here. And this is something that I learned through participating in the BC environmental assessment process, that they don't, when the mining companies' consultants will go in and collect data, they don't go down to the genus and species level. So they'll go collect bugs in the river, and they can come back and say, you know, we have lots of bugs, there's lots of mayflies here, or caddisflies, or stoneflies, but they're not actually documenting any impact to the diversity of the species. So who's who in your river. Next, with caddisflies, you can see a really big difference between the caddisflies in the Elk and the Flathead River. And I can't say what the pre-mined condition in the Elk is. That data doesn't exist. They started mining in the Elk River underground in the late 1800s. They moved above ground in the 1960s, and so there isn't data to confidently compare, but they are very similar systems. And then the mayflies, we saw something interesting. There's a lot of these yellow and blue guys going on in the Elk River. And one more quick. What's going on here is that these are species of mayflies that thrive in impacted environments. So an area that has a really high disturbance, you'll find these two species of mayflies. And this also kind of shows that greening up of the river impact that I was talking about. There's a lot of periphyton going on in the Elk River, a lot of algae from the nitrates and sulfates, and it creates great food for the mayflies and caddisflies and stoneflies. And so you will see a high abundance of these species that are more vulnerable to change in their environment. So this is just to summarize, this is kind of a high-level summary of our results across the algae and the water quality and the macroinvertebrates. So the blue is high water quality, high aquatic life diversity. The red is severely impaired water quality and aquatic life. The orange dots here are the mines, so all the tributaries of the Elk and the main stem of the Elk draining from the mines showed impacts from the mining. And then the yellow areas are more, this is where we've had logging in the past in the Montana portion of the watershed, and there's sedimentation from the roads and logging impacts there. That was kind of the end of our data collection in the Elk and Flathead rivers. The Flathead, ultimately, as I said, the BC government passed legislation that banned oil and gas and mining in that river. And so we really haven't collected any data there in the last 5 or 6 years, 4 years. But the elk is something that has really risen to attention over the last less than a decade or so. And so we started really looking at the Elk River, and it became even more, after we collected our data, we were like, wow, there's a lot of impacts taking place in the Elk River. But also, Teck Coal was seeking to expand all 5 of their open pit coal mines in the Elk River Valley. And so the fact that they were seeking permits for expansion brought an opportunity to review the existing data for impacts in the elk. And so the reason I show this slide, this is the international boundary here, and this is a provincial water quality station that's the furthest downstream from all the mines in the Elk. And here you can see they started monitoring for selenium in 1984. In the early 90s, selenium just started to exceed the provincial guideline for protection of aquatic life. And then from around the early 90s until 2015, you can see that there's this pretty strong increasing trend in selenium concentration at this site. And what happened between, the 90s and 2015 is that the mining company received permits to expand all of their coal mines, which is a concern, I think. And why do we care about selenium? Selenium, I talk more about that than the other contaminants because in the Elk River it's been a huge problem. It's kind of been the contaminant of most concern. There are other contaminants that are at high levels. But selenium, as you can see from the trend, gives real cause for concern. And the reason we're concerned about it is because it has a tendency to bioaccumulate in organisms, especially in fish and birds. And selenium it's called biphasic, which means that at really low levels it's very good for you, and then there's a very small window where it goes from good to bad. So it is common, it does occur, it's in your vitamins, but at relatively low levels it becomes highly toxic to aquatic life and to birds. And some of the impacts that you can see from selenium are spinal deformities and different types of physical deformities, which is what's going on in that fish up there. In the Elk River, I see lots of pictures of fish that are missing their gill plates. So there's a lot of the anglers will send around pictures showing missing fish with missing gill plates, which is another common deformity. But ultimately, with a really sensitive species and at a high enough level, selenium will cause the eggs to fail. So, and that can be for fish or birds. And essentially what happens is the eggs just don't hatch for these species. And so if you start to read up on selenium, you'll see that it's called the invisible contaminant because it can cause a decline in your populations, but you won't actually know why because it's causing the eggs to fail. So it's not something you'll see happening in your river. The province's answer to the problem of contamination, rising contamination in the Elk River Valley, was to initiate what was called an area-based management plan. And they started this process around 2012 when Tech started to apply to expand their mines. So they put in place a process. It was led by Tech and paid for by Tech. I participated in it on behalf of our Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Montana. And it involved the agencies and the First Nations and several stakeholders from the US side of the border. And they identified the big constituents of concern in the Elk River were selenium, cadmium, nitrates, and sulfates. And over the course of several years, the product of the Elk Valley Water Quality Plan was to permit all of the mine expansions for the mining company and put in place water quality targets moving down the Elk River. So this is the Elk. These dots are what are called order stations. And so basically the company is responsible for monitoring at different sites along the river downstream of the mines on our side. And they are obligated to meet these targets. And really the point here, without getting into a lot of detail, is that these are long-term, legally enforceable water quality targets for the Elk and fording rivers. And long-term being 2023 and 2033 for some of these numbers. And they permitted 57 micrograms per liter for selenium in the upper Fording River, which is the northernmost mine and a tributary of the Elk River. Moving down to 40 micrograms per liter, 19 further down. And then down at the international border, where Montana and British Columbia meet, is where the company is responsible for meeting 2 micrograms per liter in the river. And so this is really, from my perspective, a reading of this, and from looking at the data over the years, this is really a sacrifice of the rest of the Elk River Valley in terms of selenium impacts, because 57 micrograms per liter is almost 30 times what's considered to be protective of aquatic life. And these are the legally enforceable limits. But the short-term water quality targets are a lot higher than these, and so obviously the company's made a commitment to reduce the numbers in the river. So the commitment that the company made was to build wastewater treatment plants in the Elk Valley, a total of 3. And they built their first wastewater treatment plant in 2014. And right after they turned it on, they had a fish kill immediately downstream of the wastewater treatment plant that killed 74 West Slope cutthroat trout. I think they deoxygenated the water as it was coming out of the treatment plant. They made a mistake and they killed a bunch of fish, and they got fined for it. And so they shut the plant off. And the plant was turned off for about a year, and then it came back online. And then again, more recently, they're having issues again. And so just a couple months ago, Tech again asked for permission to shut off their treatment plant and to leave it turned off it's actually later than August 2018. It's about a year they want to leave it turned off. And that's because they're having additional problems with their wastewater treatment plant to treat selenium. So basically just the point I want to make here is that selenium has different forms, it has different species. And the selenium in the Elk River is in the form that's known as selenate. And what happened with the treatment plant most recently is that when the water is run through the treatment plant, it turns from selenate into selenite. And selenite is actually more easily taken up by the life in the aquatic environment. So basically what they did with their treatment plant accidentally was concentrate the selenium. And so within the last couple months, they've found out that the fish and the aquatic life downstream of the treatment plant have higher levels of selenium than when they go into when the water goes through the plant. So they're making the problem worse, basically, and that's why they most recently asked to turn off the wastewater treatment plant again to try and fix the problem. And I would like to tell you more about this, but the data is not available. There's not any transparency for the company data with respect to this. I don't know the exact technology that they're using in the treatment plant. And those of us that are participating in this, whether it's, even the province of BC apparently doesn't have the actual data that shows the numbers going into the treatment plant and then coming back out. So I'm not sure what's gonna happen in the Elk River, but my point here is that it's very difficult to manage selenium once it gets into your watershed. And this is a particularly worst case scenario. These mines have been going for decades. And so this is kind of like, it is a worst case scenario. And then now they're trying to find a way to treat it, but the technology really, from what I understand, the technology doesn't exist to treat selenium at the scale that these mines operate. Because I sincerely think that Tech would be using that technology if they had it available to them. And I'm fortunate to work with some really good experts on selenium through the Elk River process, and so I just started to query sort of what would you guys be concerned about up here. And what I learned is that, and maybe this is obvious to all of you, but that the juveniles will be the most vulnerable to impacts from selenium contamination, and that's because of the life history stage that they are at when they're in the rivers up here, just downstream of where the mines would be. And that because selenium bioaccumulates in the environment, the impacts that it will have on the fish is based on what the fish are eating. And so, and what they found, there's one pretty good study out there from the San Francisco Bay Delta that I started to look into, and what they found was that where selenium was bioaccumulating in the juvenile fish, it was basically impacting their growth rates. And by impacting their growth rates, it made them more susceptible to predation. So they weren't as robust as the other fish, and so that it was just more easy for them to be predated upon. Really, the point here is that a lot of times the fish that's the end point in your system, or your most important fish, like for us, it is bull trout or West Slope cutthroat trout. For you, it's your salmon species potentially. But it's really important to look at all the fish in your system because we don't know which fish is going to be the most sensitive one. And most of the time it's going to be a resident fish that is more of a bottom feeder. And is potentially, you know, the longer lived fish also have higher impacts, and that's just because of the nature of selenium being bioaccumulating in the organisms. And so the point here is just that, so where the graph there that you could see it, it turns out that a fish called the long-nosed sucker in the Kootenai River system is the one that is is bioaccumulating selenium the most. So over a period of 5 years, selenium increased in this fish by 70%. And so really this is just my advice to do the best you can to build a food web to understand the impacts of selenium in your watershed from mining. And basically what's going on here is that, so as I said before, selenium bioaccumulates, and so you have your selenium, here's your mine, comes down from the mine, gets into your water, it goes from the water into your sediments, and then your algae, and then it goes from your algae into your bugs, and then from your bugs into your fish. And each time the selenium is taken up through each of these levels of the food web, there's numbers that go with each of these jumps. They're called trophic transfer factors. And so it could be 5 times from your algae to your bug, or it could be 10 times from your bug to your fish. And each one of these fish species has a different bioaccumulation factor. So they're all going to take it up differently depending on who they are. And this is really river and species specific. So it's really important to have all this information for your system if you're going to actually understand what the impacts of selenium contamination are going to be in your environment. So this is my final slide. It's basically just a bit of take-homes. I think it's really important to have a reference condition in your river before a mining proposal is going to move forward. It's really important to do the best you can to document cumulative and interactive impacts. The interactive impacts have been a really big issue in the Elk River in terms of how is selenium interacting with nitrates and sulfates? How is cadmium interacting with selenium? How do all these things mix together? Because basically you're just putting it all into one river and then letting it go. So the interactive impacts have been a pretty big mystery for us. So having to look at the cumulative impact of multiple proposals rather than just one mine at a time is also really important. The trophic transfer data is just knowing how contaminants are going to move through your system. Stomach contents tells you what your fish are eating, and so what their risk is going to be, and then taking comprehensive baseline data is really important as well. I think that's all I have.